Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today. I'm Craig Holliday. I'm a spiritual teacher and counselor, and also one of the founding members of the Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers, along with my good friends Rick Archer and Jack O'Keefe. I'm so pleased today to welcome Mariana Kaplan. She'll be joining us, and I'm so excited to have her. I just got a couple notes here I'm going to read through. The Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers is an organization of teachers and spiritual leaders within the community. And we all have come together to grow, to study ethics, integrity, professionalism. And the three of us, Rick, Jack, and I, we've always been really big fans of Mariana. So at some point along the way, we invited her to be a special advisor to us and to join us here at the APST. And so I assume a lot of you who are joining and who are interested in today's talk are teachers or leaders in the community. And so, of course, if you have any interest in seeing what we're up to and to seeing other events like this one, please come over to our website, professionalspiritualteachers.org, where you can find more information about us and the work that we do. And so Mariana Kaplan, we're so excited to have her here. And I have like a really long bio for her. But one of the things that stood out from her bio and just her as an individual is her willingness to deeply sit with this question of what it means to be fully human and fully divine. You know, to be at this crossroads of spirituality and psychology. You know, one of the fun things about Mariana is her and I share a guru, you know, from many years ago, Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, who has a real special place in my heart as part of my lineage. And so, you know, I was so happy to see all the great work she's done in the world, and was really excited to have her a part of this movement. And so we all know there's been, you know, countless, you know, just crazy things that have happened in spiritual communities with gurus and this and that. But, you know, instead of focusing on the negative aspects of that and how that went wrong, the beautiful thing about studying psychology and the work that Mariana is doing is, you know, the willingness of teachers to be humble, for us to come together and to really have this sense of willingness to grow as teachers, as individuals on the path, to really have this sense of beginner's mind and a willingness to look at the shadow and, you know, look at how we can better serve our communities. And so I'm really excited to give the mic over to Mariana. I just had a couple things. I checked my notes here. It's nice if everyone could turn on their camera so we can see your beautiful divine faces here. Mariana's, you know, wanting that, and it's nice when we can come together as a community, you know, especially in this online world. We encourage you to save your questions to the end, but you can type them in the chat at any time. And a reminder that this webcast will be rebroadcast, so it's being recorded, so just keep that in mind. And do your best to keep your questions concise and simple. You know, that way, you know, we don't need to tell a big story each time. You know, we get on the microphone. We all have been in situations like that where some person might ask one question that goes on for 20 minutes. So just be really mindful when you're speaking and what your question actually is. And so I'd like to really welcome everyone. And yeah, Mariana.
Thank you so much. And I'm just beaming inside as I see all of these people that I know from around the world and their faces popping up. And of course, there's all the people I don't know, but I'm just delighted to be in this conversation with you all. And if you want to, as your people are still coming in, so we're just starting up here, but if you're from, I'm here in cold, but you know, not on fire, California, and if you're from other places and want to say hello and where you're from, feel free to write that in the chat box so people can see that. And really just want to call out that I see Rick Archer sitting here present, my new board. This is the first board I ever, well, no, the second. Lindsay's here. I joined 2 boards for the first time this year. But what the work that APST is doing really spoke to me. So as we are beginning, we're a global community speaking right together from around the world. So I want to invite people to drop into your bodies. And for some people that may be like, oh, where's that? And that's fine. And other people have a practice, but I want to bring an invitation for us wherever we are seated in the world to bring attention to our bodies and in some way to feel our seat, to feel our hearts, to extend a deep benefit of the doubt. I'd appreciate it if you extend it to me, but also to each other. And I want to bring forth really rich and challenging information and possibilities. And I want to invite you to do that with me. So from there, we'll begin our conversation. And I also I just saw Jack appear. I can't see everyone on the same screen, but my board. So here's Jack O'Keefe, and here's Craig and Rick. I'd really like to hear your voices in this webinar at a certain point, because we've had a lot of rich conversations about that, and I'd like the others here to be able to participate in that as well. So I'd like to call you out here if you're willing. And Amir and Israel. So people who are really working on these topics are here together. So let's make use of our time to see if anything useful, a new feeling, a new possibility can open in us. And when we're sharing, especially on these topics, the sharing isn't, I really don't want to direct it to a specific sharing about any particular community. I'm not going to talk about what teachers I agree with and what teachers I don't agree with. If you knew how much I had to been asked about that, you would understand. I want to talk about what's possible. So a little bit about me for those who don't know me, and I'm just going to share the part that's related to what we're talking about. So today I want to talk about preventative psychological health in spiritual communities, among spiritual leaders and in spiritual communities and in our own spiritual practice. And when I was in my 20s, which was a long time ago, I had a guru and he asked me to write a book about premature claims to enlightenment. And this was 20-some years ago. And I said, how can I write a book about premature claims to enlightenment? I know nothing about enlightenment. How would I even know anything about premature claims to enlightenment? And what I did is I love to travel, so I went all around the world. At that time, we couldn't just do these little Zoom calls, so I would travel on trains, planes, and automobiles to some distant village in India and interview some woman there and go to places and try to seek out the information from the people that I knew or wanted to know. And that book became Halfway Up the Mountain, The Era of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. And from that time, I started to hear more stories about disillusionment than illusionment. So several years later, I did my doctoral dissertation on the perils and pitfalls of the guru-disciple relationship in Western culture. After that, I wrote a book called Eyes Wide Open on cultivating discernment on the spiritual path. So I've spent many, and I'm a clinical psychotherapist, and I'm in regular practice. So among the daily work of psychotherapy, I've done a lot of interventions when there's been spiritual scandals, when there's been mass departures of disappointed students from spiritual teachers, when there's been huge breaks in the gap between a teacher's spiritual awakening and their psychological expression in their communities. And I think, right, over the years, the stories of the heartbreak and devastation, and many years they really they really hurt because there's been so much of it. And of course, in my work, I do it all confidentially, except in forums like this and in books. So what I'm bringing to you today is really hundreds, if not thousands, of people's of confidential experience on the path. And at a certain point, which was about 10 or 12 years ago, I was a bit tired of just working with the devastation. So I started doing this other work that I've been doing for many years on integrating yoga and Western psychology and supporting this new integration. And still doing the other work to support communities along the way. But this fall, which is something I want to talk to you about, I was invited by a spiritual community to start to do preventative and proactive psychological work with them instead of coming in after the usual sex scandal or the power scandal or all of these various distortions, including things that have resulted in people's death. Like that's when it gets really, really serious. And these people asked me to do preventative work, and that's what I'm inspired about, and that's what I want to bring to you. So I'm going to use this community as an example. I'm not going to speak specifically about who they are because I think the principles are more important than the specifics. But what I would say just a little bit more to preface it is that these scandals, these fallouts are so common. Craig, who introduced me, does similar work to me. And what I have found, it's not just that these really corrupt, bad people, try to make themselves into spiritual teachers and then, they drop in their corruption and things go bad. I think it much more often is that it's good people and well-intentioned people, and people have awakenings at different levels, and they are excited. And like so many of us, I know so many of you on this call, right? There's a call to serve, and we start to bring that forth. And what often happens is that the psychologically unintegrated material in ourselves is what ends up creating the distortion. So in all of these many things that can go wrong on the spiritual path, both as teachers and as practitioners, it is very rarely the fault of a spiritual tradition that has gone awry. I'm a long-term yoga practitioner, and something like yoga is so impeccable and forgiving that even a good enough teacher, or even when it is taught and practiced with sincerity and goodness, the yoga carries itself, and so do all these other religions and traditions. So it's not that there's something that goes wrong very often with the teachings or the specific dharma. It's almost always the psychological integration and the psychological work of the individual student or leader that starts, and how that works between students and teachers that creates the challenge. And here I want to shout out, there's all these messages in the chat. I'm just going to look for a minute. We have New Zealand and Washington, D.C., and Florida, Virginia, Iowa, Washington, Amsterdam, Germany, Sweden, Canada, Vancouver. Thank you so much for joining us. So I know that many people like myself come to the spiritual path with a mixture of deep and authentic longing and personal suffering, and often trauma. And sorry, I'm getting a little distracted by that chat box, but I'll figure that out as we go along. So there's many spiritual teachings, and I think that's starting to change. And I think I see a lot of people here from like a non-dual world, and I think the non-dual world and the yogic world are slower to catch on to this than the Judaic world or the Buddhist world. But in many non-dual and spiritual communities, there has been often purported a view that, right, the psychological work is in the realm of the dual, or it's in the realm of right, our human stuff, and that stuff can create an endless narcissistic labyrinth that cannot be worked out, and that the real, right, the real material or the real bias is toward the spiritual experience, toward the awakening, the so-called awakening, the so-called enlightenment, right? It's been a very strong bias that I think is starting to recorrect itself in the world. I think that many teachers and practitioners, at least initially, whether they're younger or come to the path later, come with the hopes that if our spiritual practice is done well enough and diligently enough, that will somehow take care of the psychological material. Right? That's a very common assumption. And my consistent experience is that it doesn't. Right? That the spiritual awakening and our depth psychological work are, right, they're highly compatible, they weave together, but that they're very often two distinct processes. And in my last book, Yoga and Psyche, that came out earlier this year, I really claimed, and I'm starting to share this with much more conviction, that I deeply believe that anybody who is in a function of spiritual leadership, and I want to share what I mean by spiritual leadership more in a minute or two, but people who are in that function or a dedicated spiritual student need to undertake a course of depth psychological inquiry over a significant period of time, not forever, but over a significant period of time, and that psychological inquiry is not repeated, but re-engaged at each developmental stage of their lives. So I personally am totally committed to that. And the reason that it needs to be re-engaged is because at different stages of development, new possibilities emerge, right? There's our earlier work on the path, and then maybe we have children, or maybe we get married, or maybe we get divorced, or maybe we come out, or we or the people we know get older or start dying, and truly new spiritual and psychological possibilities emerge with each developmental stage. Right? So I'm long ago left the idea that there is an enlightenment that people will attain, and that it's fixed, and you get there and you stay there, and that your human development just grows with it. I know that's not true. I'm okay with other people here hold a different perspective. But Craig briefly mentioned Yogi Ramsurat Kumar, and of all my lifelong studies and interviews and pursuit of the path, this particular yogi who I met and stayed in his company for a year when I was 25, when I even knew that I was too young to really understand or take in fully what he was offering. He was the most developed human being that I've ever met in my life and had the privilege to spend time with. And by the time I had met him in his development, his so-called enlightenment, what people will think of as a big awakening where everything changes and never goes back, and you can read books, right, and your state matches with certain states. I think that's what had happened in his life 50 years before I met him, because he was in his 70s, or 40 years before I'd met him. And what I was fortunate to meet at that young an age was that a practitioner that never stopped. So I got to see somebody 40 years later into that process who never sat in his enlightenment, right? Never claimed anything. Never, he was just continuing to go forward. And even though I was young on my path, I got the very clear impression and teaching from him that there really is no end, right, to our spiritual development and our spiritual possibility. And in my own life, right, I've been studying spirituality, yoga, and psychology in tandem the whole time. I really believe the same is true of the deep psyche. And my inspirations are those great psychologists who take the psychological work as a mystical path and a path of endless possibility. And it's not that we have to get somewhere before we're okay and before we can start sharing and giving our gifts, but that if we don't remain a student throughout that whole, that it's a path, right, that we engage as a vocation, both the paths of spirituality and psychology. and they're lifelong engagements. So now I'm going to turn this conversation to the work that I've been doing with this specific spiritual community this fall, and also how I'm watching this grow. And then we'll open it up to conversation. And I want to invite you when we do that, or even if you write your questions in sooner, I'm not going to look at them until a little bit later, until I have a pause, but you're welcome to write them in at any point. I really want to invite you to engage the real challenges that you feel and contributions you have. So admittedly, when Rick and Craig and Jack reached out to me and said, do you want to join this board? I thought, oh God, another, more talk about spiritual teachers, right? I saw their mission, right? We want to create a place where spiritual leaders, I forgot to mention what I mean by spiritual leaders, so I'll still wind back to that. But right, where spiritual leaders can come together and really form alliances and engage in a living conversation about the very real challenges that happen in spiritual leaders, and to create spaces and forums where this can happen. But partly my heart sank because I thought, oh, here we go, I have to hear more devastations, and I mean, my inbox, right, of the last 20 years is of one wreckage after the other, and it's really devastating. But at the same time, I read what they were trying to do, and like many of you, I'm called to serve, so I resonated with not only their vision, but with them as people. But at the same time, this new work started emerging, and it wasn't work I set out to do. I just responded to a call, and it was different than many of the calls that I had received the last 20 years. So just before I wind into that, I want to say that when I talk about spiritual leadership, both in the context of our webinar today and also in the context of the group or groups that I'm going to be opening up in the winter, I want to include a very broad net in that. So not somebody who has to self-identify as a spiritual teacher. I very happily have never chosen or wanted that role, and love to be a peer on the path and an ally to people. That's where I feel comfortable and congruent. I know that I teach things, but I identify as a practitioner. But when I say spiritual leaders, you may be a leader in your, in your family. You may be a mindfulness teacher. You may be a yoga teacher. You may be a workshop, a workshop giver. You may be a psychotherapist. I'm looking around and seeing everybody, so I'm getting all these examples of leaders who I know, right? Who's passionate about these subjects and wants to deliver your service with both, greater expansiveness, but start to work with people on these challenging issues. You may be you may be teaching spirituality or whatever you're teaching in a preschool. So to me, it doesn't matter. You may be somebody who's young and interested and hasn't had a leadership role yet, but want to contribute. So when I say leaders and, thinking about the Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers, I'm really want to open that identification broadly to people who feel like they can benefit from this conversation. I'm looking at somebody who runs a huge yoga studio, right? It's going to come into every single yoga studio, not at some point, but, monthly or biannually, kinds of things we're talking about. So when I look at leaders, and I happen to know a lot of people on this call, but those who I don't, I want you to feel included. And also with APST, I want you to feel included. I think we can really open a broad net in a broad scope of inclusion in what we're talking about as leaders. So when I got a call from a spiritual teachers, a teaching team who wanted support this year, the initial request that they had given to me and brought to me is, that they were a growing spiritual community, and that issues had come up, right? One or a group of students had become upset about certain things. They were making complaints. They were leaving the community, right? And these teachers who had read my books said, we want you to help us to examine the variables that led to the situation. We want you to get to know us and to put your eye and your vision on what we're doing, and bring forth the areas that in our teaching and in the community structure that we're building that you think may have been overlooked. So that was the beginning of the conversation. And then as the work developed, they said, well, actually, you know, we have a group of trainers. We have a group of, let's say, 12 or so trainers, because the community is growing, who are responsible for starting to share our work in different leadership functions. We would like you to psychologically and trauma educate these leaders so that we prepare them to not only carry out our work with integrity, but to really try to learn, right? Learn from the mistakes of so many communities and learn this material so that we won't, we and they, right? Because if you're a leader and you're responsible for other leaders, their own psychological blind spots really are also within your field of responsibility. And then they, you know, I asked them, well, do you want me to do this or this? And they said, no, you take free reign and start to teach them the kinds of things that you think that are important and are overlooked, right? So that made my heart sing, because to me, even if a teacher comes, and many have, and they have fallen already, and they say, you know, this is what I've done, and I had sex with these 5 students, and I'm deeply repentant, and I want to come forth, but I'm afraid it's going to destroy my community, but I know that I need to make amends, and I want to look at my blind spots. You know, I greet that person with an open heart, and I hold them to accountability, but I don't see anybody who chooses, right, who chooses to still be in a learning process. I take all these people into my heart, and there is not going to be a spiritual organization where ruffles do not come up, right? It's a disassociated spiritual organization if we think that's happening, because we're dealing right with human beings. It's inevitable. So when this opportunity came up to begin to choose to educate leaders and prevent work, that it's really started making my heart sing. And as I told them, you know, my free time as a parent and an author and a psychotherapist really is my runs in the woods that I take by my house. And I was just noticing that the opportunity was occupying a lot of my free attention and a lot of my pleasurable attention, because it really started opening up this new possibility. And this possibility is still opening up. But what I've been doing with these people, some of them I'm noting on the call, I don't see all the screens and all the faces, is we started to come together in bi-monthly groups, and not only just talking. Today we can talk about this work and field some questions, but not just talking about it, but going into depth psychological inquiry with each other, you know, asking people to take this material into their lives, to work with each other in between groups, and to start to really bring forth this material. And we created, and I think this is key, and I'll talk more about my vision for going forward with this, but just like psychotherapy, right? Because I really adhere to the ethics of my license. I think they're not only, I not only do that because I'm, you know, obliged by law to do that, but even when I do my spiritual counseling work, which is not under that umbrella, I think that they're very effective codes of ethics. And so when I've been working with this group, it's under strict confidentiality. And in psychotherapy, many of you probably aren't aware, but we include that there's limits of confidentiality, and that's when somebody's in may be of danger to themselves or somebody else, right? Which is really important when there's sexual conduct with minors. There's certain things that are, that have been thought about for many decades for good reasons. So we create a very precise of space of confidentiality and who's included in that, if that's ever going to be breached or shared with somebody else, like Craig announced at the beginning of the call that this will be reproduced. Very, very clear boundaries of confidentiality. And then we come together and we really have started to get into the lives of right, our own personal lives and how we're relating to the kinds of material that's coming forth. And I'll share some of the topics in just a minute. And then as the work has evolved with this community, I went and visited them and led a group process and stayed in the community environment for a short period of time. And among the things, and the reason I'm sharing this is not so we can see, oh, this is what's happening in one community, but to really open up the possibility for what can happen other places. So what impressed me about that particular visit is that I was in a space where somebody who is, self-identified as a spiritual teacher could be in the space with the students and say, hey, this is who I've gone to for help. There's my spiritual teachings that I represent, but that I know that nobody is beyond ongoing development. And this is my therapist, right? I just sat there and said, this is my therapist. And this is the person that I am looking to outside of our circle, right? Which is a key variable outside of the system. This is the person that I am looking to for help. And because I had been working with a number of the students, both in confidential therapeutic settings and in the group, I brought to the table a number of the issues that I wanted these people to look at. And we spent time, and I was invited freely to bring forth really challenging material. And not just what as I was sitting in the community. And for example, in that community, I read something and the teacher was recommending celibacy. And I had a question mark about that, how effective that is in many communities over a period of time and under what circumstances. And we really sat with the leaders. I was in a spiritual community for 14 years with a guru, and I said to them, I was never in a space, with my teacher, even tried to create those spaces at times, but where we actually sat and brought forth the challenges, the things that we disagreed with, the things we wanted our spiritual teacher to look at. And we had never been in that kind of conversation. I really noted while I was there that I know this in spiritual scandals, but in this new proactive work, that having someone outside of the system is a really important variable. There's just too much at stake when you're inside the system. The inevitable alliances and desires for approval and power and not rocking the boat, or being somebody who always rocks the boat, or it's like the system's like a family system there. It really takes somebody from outside the system to come in and do that work. I'm gonna share some of the topics that I've been working on with this community and that I want to work on in the future, and in this group that I'm hopefully going to assemble and ideally work with in other communities if that's called forth. So why psychological inquiry and support is necessary for spiritual leaders, right? Why I think that anyone in a position of spiritual leadership needs to do engaged depth psychological embodied inquiry over a long period of time. And having known many, 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 many spiritual teachers over the years, many of them will speak to valuing it, and fewer actually engage the process. Though many do, as I look around, I'm seeing many of the exceptions here. But really calling that forth, and whether it's done in a group or done in individual therapy, that somebody's degree of enlightenment or stages of realization do not compute to their psychological integration. And the lack of psychological integration, again, right, is what will inevitably bring forth the challenges in the communities. 2, projections, transference, and countertransference in the student-teacher relationship. Right? So the inevitability of projections and transference into the teacher, and then in psychological language, the countertransference, how the teacher is responding internally to the projections, right? And where in the world, hopefully at APSD and what we're creating, where can a spiritual teacher come and say, man, like people have been saying to me in my groups or confidential meetings, I haven't done anything wrong yet, but I notice when I'm teaching that a disproportionate amount of my energy goes to X group, you know, the attractive women in the room, or someone else could label, you know, the ones that aren't too attractive, but still attractive and looking at me a certain way and bringing, but kind of wounded and bringing a vulnerability. So inevitably I'll get a certain kind of energy from them, right? Or they're gay, you know, I'm teaching to a whole room, but I'm paying attention to these guys or these women, right? Where can teachers go and say, like, this is my experience, teachers or leaders, this is my experience. What's your experience? You know, how do you navigate that? I've got so many, I get these emails and the yoga teacher will say, like, I'm about to do this thing and I don't want to do it. Can we make a session? And we set up a session and then they cancel the session, right? And then the scandal comes into my inbox. And it's like, what if we could talk about it, you know, without shame and with real engaged dialogue and peers before the thing happens? And I know I keep referring to the example of a sexual scandal, but I call that out because and Craig, you could weigh into this a little later in the conversation if you want, but still I would say 90 to 95% of the breakdowns in communities that I've dealt with over 20-ish years, 90 to 95% of them have to do with either sexual relationships, sexual misconduct, sexual inappropriateness. And I promise you, you know, the men on the call, I know this applies to men and women both, and still the vast majority of the scandals happen with men. Though I feel strongly, and you'll see in all my books, I am not just trying to educate spiritual teachers, but I want to support spiritual students in understanding the situations and the energies and the variables that they bring forth that support the arising of these the sexual scandals specifically. I think they can be largely avoided if, again, with our own psychological work as students and really understanding what we're dealing with. That's what my book Eyes Wide Open was about. You know, as students, how do we become intelligent consumers? How do we prepare ourselves for what's going to come forth? I had a friend who's a Tibetan Buddhist Lama and psychotherapist say to me informally years ago, she said, I think that you know, I wish that every new spiritual student on the path could be given the information, you know, if you are studying, particularly with a male spiritual teacher, I'm sure there's some women out there, I just never hear about them. But, you know, if you're going to be doing this, assume the likelihood that at some point, if your teacher is straight, that they're going to come on to you, and be prepared for how you want to respond. That makes my heart sing. I know that teachers are responsible, right? I know about the power differentials and so forth, but letting students like really get educated on what they're going to be encountering. That just because you're experiencing powerful transmissions and something coming from a teacher does not mean that he or she has done their psychological work, does not mean that he or she knows how to manage their sexual energy. In fact, I would consider the likelihood that they don't. But who's there to give us that information? Certainly there was no one to tell me that as a young woman, as I ran into one sweat lodge, you know, felt up in the sweat lodge and the next shaman, so forth, right? What I'm bringing is largely from my own personal experience and then the hundreds or thousands of others. the necessity of peer support for spiritual teachers, right? Most spiritual teachers operate on an island and in a vacuum. Many of them don't have friends, don't have allies. It's a challenging position to be in, right? Where you're running a community, and in addition to everyone's true devotion, there's endless projections and people's desires for power, recognition. And so in APST, right, in the kind of groups I'm running, creating peer support, and ideally peer support, including, but also outside of the tradition that one's practicing in. So creating the necessity of peer support. It's really amazing how many spiritual teachers do not have friends and allies. Then trauma in the body and spiritual life. Right. So nowadays, for all Western spiritual practitioners and teachers to at least begin to understand trauma, it's something I've pursued avidly post everything, postgraduate and postdoctoral. I pursued a 3-year trauma training course because I saw that in my own experience, in spite of the service I was doing or the books I was writing, there was material that was in my body, right? That I was not able to digest through any spiritual work. And it's nice, feel people settling into their bodies, as we mentioned the body. So as I'm talking about that, let's again take another sweep, thanks Peter, into our bodies, right? So as spiritual leaders, we need to start to understand trauma and its impact, not just childhood trauma, but the understandings of trauma that have emerged in the last decade have been so profound and important. And they include not just these big things that happen to people, but developmental trauma is becoming much more understood. The things that not only happened, but didn't happen in our courses of development. Complex trauma. So there's not just maybe one thing, but layered traumas that happen. And some of these complex traumas aren't even things that we could see. Maybe, we were raised by a parent who had a low grade depression or dysthymia, so it wasn't even named. Or, right, a parent, or maybe there was an abortion or something we never even learned of and wasn't spoken about. But we, our own psychological development was impacted by that. So these are just a couple of examples. And everyday trauma, right? Everyday trauma is referring to what's happening just being alive in our today's world, right? So before the elections happened, I started, for the first time in my whole life as a psychotherapist, I was talking to people about their experiences of what was happening politically in the world. People were needing to use their therapeutic time to talk about their challenges and fears of what was happening politically in the world. And environmentally, right? Just a month ago, I was doing sessions with people in the next town to mine that was on fire, who couldn't even get over here because they had to be home in case they were evacuating. And every time we turn around, right, and we have every, sorrowful reason to think that it's going to keep increasing, that there's environmental trauma. So there's not just what happened, there's what's happening. So as spiritual leaders, to proactively educate ourselves in trauma, and not just about it, but start to do the trauma work ourselves. It's necessary. I don't know what was necessary several hundred years ago and thousands of years ago, or what is necessary in Asia. I know that from 16 trips to India. I do not know what's necessary there. I know, but I speak to the Western practitioner, and we can't be spiritual leaders anymore without assessing our own trauma and starting to learn how to see that in other people and how to work with that in our bodies. Spiritual bypassing in spiritual teachers and students, right? 20 years ago, spiritual bypassing, my dear beloved friend John Wellwood coined this term, but people it was there, but it wasn't named. And right, spiritual bypassing, for those who aren't as familiar with the term, it's the ways that we use our spiritual ideas, practices, perspectives, identifications to bypass or avoid psychological challenges, relational challenges, developmental tasks in life, dealing with the real gritty things that our human psyche and individuality is made of, right? And spiritual bypassing, especially in some communities more than others, I'll call out my own, global yoga community and the representatives of the, newer non-dual traditions. The most susceptibility to spiritual bypassing happens, as I see it in these communities. It happens in all of us. But to start to inventory, how our spirituality is bringing us into more unification with other people in all aspects of our experience, rather than separating us and supporting us and avoiding things that need to be addressed. Boundaries and confidentiality, which I mentioned, right? How important it is to know, to study our own boundaries. Again, most of us come to the path wounded. When there's been trauma, when there's been alcoholism, we have no reference for boundaries as we come into adulthood. So we have to learn them rather than assume that they're in place. And again, that's doable, really doable and wonderful work. And within those boundaries, establishing clear parameters of confidentiality, because people get really sloppy. And I mean, not too long ago, I was in a call, right? And it was a workshop leader and the girlfriend, a man and woman were in the training, and the girlfriend was the assistant. And within the context of the training, the leader is feeding information to her assistant about how she sees her boyfriend. And then the boyfriend's devastated because he feels shamed in the training because the workshop leader is talking to the assistant about, about material about the participant. This stuff happens all the time. Just a couple more, and this is just the starting point of what I think needs to happen and can happen. Creating healthy systems of feedback within spiritual communities. And in the example I gave of when I went to this community, and they said, do whatever you want when you're here. And I said, we have to have the conversation about all the stuff that you may make space as a teacher and say, bring it on, but without somebody facilitating it and helping that along, it's not going to happen in the same way, right? So creating healthy systems of feedback to and from spiritual leaders in their communities. And then cultic dynamics and group mind or groupthink, right? So the inevitable unconscious agreements that are existing within communities. When I showed up to the ashram where I lived for 5 years when I was 25, I'd been around the ashram in India, but I was suddenly living in this place, and I felt the whole presence of all these agreements. And I said to somebody, I'm like, would you please tell me where I can find what I'm supposed to do and not do, because I am doing the wrong thing here and there and I don't know what it is. And she said, I remember she saying, I said, no, it's there's nothing, nothing in particular. And right, as I was to learn living there was at least, 100 do's and don'ts. And if you do, if you do, you're rewarded. And if you don't, you're out of whatever you're out of. So just to bring detailed awareness to group mind and group think. So these are the areas, right? I hope it's not too depressing a list. For me, it's inspiring. It's not inspiring if I think about all the travesty that's happened and is happening. But when I think about the possibility of coming together and examining these things, right, out of love, we're looking in the dark, right? Not because we suck and because somebody's bad and psychologically undeveloped, right? But I've never been afraid of the dark in that way. It's like my path of enlightenment, right, is like going into the darkness, and each time we uncover it, it's like we're bringing illumination, we're bringing awareness to the areas, right? Not this just what levels of light can I uncover, from my heart, maybe my head, or maybe my heart up, but probing into the darkness and bringing light into these places, right? That's where the integration comes through. So I'll want to share what I'm envisioning. It's really just being envisioned, and I'm going to open up the field. I'll look for the questions and start bringing forth your contribution, and you can start writing them in the chat box. So I hadn't intended to do the work that I've been doing this fall with this community. but it has moved me so much. And then Jack and Rick and Craig came along. And when I see this happening so effectively in one community, my heart says, well, how can this happen in other places? And so what I decided to do as just the next step is to begin a group in the winter. I have a tentative start date of January 10th, but I'm going to begin when the right group of people are formed. And if schedules don't match, I could see forming 1 or 2 groups in the winter and spring. And now I'm envisioning people coming together, self-identified leaders, and it doesn't need to be that you are ahead of anything, or somebody's here on this call who wrote to me, can I come on the call? I'm part of this group and I'm interested in prevention, but I don't want to teach. Yes. I don't know, to me, that's a leader. It's certainly a leader in what we're talking about, because there's not enough of them. And bring together a group of people from different traditions in a confidential space. So I'm going to run a 12-week group and bring together people and start to work as I have within this one community, but cross traditions, and not just, you've named some spiritual traditions, but I'm really interested in including religious leaders in the conversation. I think religious leaders are, thought leaders, psychological leaders, and have this encounter together. It's a facilitated encounter, but it's really a facilitated peer encounter, and start to do this dedicated inquiry and within a group. So that's going to be the offering. We'll have a follow-up because we have your, we now know who you are by signing up for the webinar. I know a lot of people signed up who said we can't be here today, but we want to know what you're doing in the future. So including all those people. So that's what I'm going to start to offer in the spring. And this is a piece of work I really wasn't looking for. So I didn't make a course of action. I'm not trying to create a new movement of doing this, but I am responding to a need. It's like even just putting out this call, and 100 people. APSC started a month ago officially. That we launched. I wasn't there at the Science and Non-Duality conference, and in a public way, and just putting out the call. As I did, right, and the emails went out. I got at least 5 emails, one from Brazil, do you know about what's happening in this group? And then another one from Europe, do you know that this teacher who, is much beloved is having, this sexual thing going on. So just by putting out that email, there was more and more and more. So I knowing that there is a proactive way, right? I'm happy to come in. I'm not happy. I'm willing to come in when the fallouts happen. It's so devastating, when you've seen it so many times. But to come together and say, like, yeah, here's my gifts and here's my challenges, and let's like get together and get down with what's really what's really alive and challenging for us. That's what I want to bring forth. It's the next step for me. So now I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to go to this chat box. So bear with me. Start to bring forth your questions. And Craig and whoever else is moderating, Jack, if you see these questions before me, I'm going to bring forth some of them to my attention. You're most welcome to. For people I can see, you're also welcome to raise your hand, and we can engage that way. Okay, so here's Elizabeth. How many leaders, teachers here are supervisors? I strongly believe that in the value of this as dedicated, neutral, reflective space for those working with others' stuff. It is distinctive and complementary to therapy. Supervision is more than that is more than pure support, though that's useful too. So, oh, and Tina, I didn't see you there. Hi. So I don't know, I'm not gonna try to fuel that, but rather to speak to that when I asked, so I can offer CEs continuing education units, and when I wrote to the people who are sponsoring me, which is another wonderful organization, and going out of their way to offer continuing education units to people who are offering spiritually oriented courses. And they said to me, you know, will you please include mental health workers and supervisors in this offering, because they're, you know, they also are in the group of people who are in need of the support. It's going to be a little easier for me if you're here in the call and want to say something to raise your hand. I'll also go over the questions, but okay. Bioemotive, that's you. Doug, nice to meet you, see you. Thank you for showing up. You wanted to share your question? Can you unmute yourself? Or no, Suzanne can unmute.
We both unmuted yourselves simultaneously. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. We actually met when you were here for an Integral Spirituality conference in Winnipeg about 10 years ago or something.
Okay, I knew your name. Thank you.
Yeah, and you were doing yoga with your young child in the corners. It was really cool.
Yeah.
I guess I'm pretty interested in this area, and I've been doing some work in it myself. And I just want to know your reflections on at what point does the sensitivity to this people's psychological process shift the focus from spiritual training and transformation to psychotherapeutic healing, and almost a replacement for therapy, and kind of, especially when you start getting proactive, right? Whether it's with the teachers or the students. At what point do you just shifting domains because you see it's also really important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One thing that just sit with that for a moment. I mean, what I want to do in the preventative work with the teachers is that we are bringing our own awareness and deeper work, or teachers, leaders. And when I say that, please just know that I'm including all of you. I know those distinctions aren't really important to me. But bringing that training, right, without sending every spiritual leader off to a 3-year graduate school program, bringing detailed awareness, some psychoeducation, and actual inquiry to the leaders. I hear you, because it's like even in my psychotherapy practice at this point, when there's such a distinction when I am working with people psychologically who are wanting to do psychological work in the service of their spiritual development, right? And in service of the offering and of their own integration and on their own spiritual path, versus people who want to come or who come, just really needing to do baseline psychotherapy, which I, did for many, many years in the trenches. So right there's a distinction. One of the things that I think, like in this, so another element that I didn't speak about in this community. So I'm working with the teachers, right, psychotherapeutically and with their own trauma, working with their leadership team. And then I'm supervising a therapist who's working with individuals within the community who are wanting to do their like initial psychological work. So they're either self-referred or recommended. Their teacher recommends that they do psychotherapeutic work. And I'm sorry I forgot to mention that element, but it's really important, because otherwise we could, for example, somebody wrote to me after the meeting I had done and said, if I'd had my choice, I would have had you speak to shame that day. And I said, well, I could speak to shame. I mean, I've spoken to shame for many, many years, but that really it belongs to the domain of many competent psychotherapists, right? And to begin to do work on your personal shame and how it's showing up in your relationship to your teachers. It could be highlighted in some kind of community gathering, but it's not how I would choose to spend my time in that community. So here I want to focus on educating and supporting leaders, because when we as leaders are really continuing to strengthen our own awareness, we're going to have a lot more discernment in the decisions that we make and the kind of material you're bringing forth, right? And when and how much and in what context to bring this to our student body. And and certainly to stay out of trouble, which is really, you know, to avoid falling into really strong pits and pitfalls. And then like doing some, so I guess in the context, I don't know what context you're specifically thinking about, but even in the context of a spiritual community, and the spiritual community that I was a part of for many years, after I got my trauma training, I said, hey, you know, we have so much trauma in our community. I just want to come for a day and do a free trauma training because I love you all. And I asked that for about 5 years before I stopped asking, because it wasn't invited. And then this other community, you know, I had a moment where I'm like, okay, I couldn't do this with the community that I was in, but I can do it with another community. So not to replace, right? So to place the psychological work in the context of whatever spiritual process and keep reprioritizing that, right? And then when people need specific dedicated psychological work, which if people haven't done it, most of us need to then refer. And right, even on this call, I was seeing some therapists that I've supervised, right? So to, I don't know, part of APST may be, I'm thinking in the moment out loud with my colleagues, but right, we start to make a referral, our own referral network of therapists who are competent for doing, you know, doing the psychological work with people. I know there's a spiritual emergence network that has had endless incarnations, but you know, that's an important possibility too. Want to say anything more about that, Doug, or something more specific that I'm not speaking to yet? Oh, can you unmute him?
Yeah,
Right.
I couldn't unmute myself. I mean, it's a really hard question, and now that you've spoken to it, maybe I can try and get more precise. But like, is there a line or a context? You kind of hinted at it, where you can say there's a difference between sort of a psychotherapeutic, I want to stop suffering, let's get me to normal, and a more, I'm doing well and I'm in a spiritual context and I need to be proactive that my shadow stuff doesn't come up and bite me. Like, is it a continuum, or is it separate categories? Like, how do you see it and where do you make the distinction? Because I've actually, in my life coaching practice, done some work with some spiritual teachers, and just in helping them through some of their childhood trauma, deep feeling beliefs that have distorted fundamental views of the world, not in a way that was dysfunctional, they showed up to their communities more fully, and actually, without the community knowing they'd been doing this work, said, wow, there's something different about you, right? So it's really clear that all beings can benefit from the psychotherapeutic process and waking up to these dimensions. But I'm wondering how you classify these. Are they two separate processes? Is there a kind of intervention for the spiritually inclined that's different than just standard psychotherapeutic intervention?
Yeah, thank you. So ideally, you know, as the example you gave, and as the pilot project that I've been doing, the new psychological awareness of the teacher starts to get integrated into the actual language and processes of the community, so that whatever, right, I'm not trying to replace or deconstruct what people have going on, but right, bring in critical new awarenesses. You know, I name those points, but each one of them, right, they're critical for any spiritual teacher and community to be aware of. And then to start bringing in to the teachers, and then ideally to the community, a language to talk about that. And I do see that psychotherapy in the context of spiritual development and psychotherapy for the sake of itself are, they're quite distinct. And more and more, I really just, I can't find myself doing so much of the other, not because I don't value it, but because when we are placing our psychological work in the context of our spiritual awakening, it's, you know, you ask where I make the line, that's when they start to, you know, that's when they're part and partial. And the psychological work is ongoing. And we don't just do the psychological work because something's wrong with us. We do the psychological work because something is right with us. And we understand that in the process of human development and in the process of spiritual unfolding, right, as layers, right, I do yoga, right, as layers of even the body, right, and the structure open up, layers of unawakened material open up with it. And we can call that psychological. Right, and if we do that in the context of the awakening, like then we have real possibility.
Okay. So if I can try and reflect back what you've said, just to make sure I'm not distorting it too much, I think I'm hearing you say that for, at least in a spiritual context, just making people aware of these dimensions and bringing it to surface as possible dynamics they have to be attending to is often enough for the spiritually inclined to wake up to those factors and treat them as objects, not get caught in them in the same way. Are you kind of
becoming aware of them and then
just
really
waking them up to these dynamics? Education is a lot of it.
Education and then individual or group, right? So that we don't talk about it. I remember teaching a workshop and with a yoga teacher on yoga and psychology, and she's saying, oh yeah, I'm all about psychology. I have lots of friends who are therapists. I've never done it myself. It's not the same to have friends that are therapists than to do the work and to even have great conversations with them. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Amir, I saw you wrote a question, but you're here live and I might get to see you in Israel in a couple of weeks, hopefully. So maybe you can just bring your consideration to a conversation. Can you unmute Amir, Suzanne?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I was wondering if there are ways in which psychotherapeutic intervention, like what you're speaking about, can interfere with or be a hindrance to spiritual development or spiritual breakthrough. Specifically, I'm thinking, my favorite topic of the teacher-student relationship and the question of surrender and situations, for example, such as crazy wisdom teachers who have to do things which don't really don't look very good from the psychotherapeutic point of view, but can be actually very helpful in facilitating the student or students' spiritual development. So do you see that risk and how do you deal with it?
Yeah. Thank you. It's an important, a really important question. And I understand that question, having been the student of a quote unquote crazy wisdom teacher for 14 years. And it comes up. It comes up in the community that I'm working with, and I think as of today, I would stand and that bringing this rigorous embodied, right? I want to keep including embodied trauma informed psychological awareness to ourselves as students and as teachers, right? Is ultimately going to be a much greater support than any risk factor. If you are a trauma psychologically blah informed student with a crazy wisdom teacher, and you're asked to do something that doesn't resonate with you, you're going to have a lot more information from your own system, especially again underlying the body in this case, than if you have not done that work. And if you're a crazy wisdom teacher and you're getting channeled, you see, we talked about this when I visited the community, you might see, several steps ahead what the student, you see a vision and you see a possibility and you can slice through this thing. Well, it's not necessarily taking into account the student's family, for example, right? How many people have left or made terrible decisions in relationship to their children or their partners and made great wreckage in the name of surrender, even if the teacher has, it was a recommendation that was congruent. it's not necessarily taking into account where that person's development is. So sometimes, or where they're coming from in their surrender, right? So somebody surrenders and the teacher has the vision, but their psychological integration isn't even necessarily ready to hold that, or they're surrendering for the wrong reason. We had a lot of that in the community I was in, right? The teacher may have been on and the students were sincere, but after the teacher died, there was so much trauma that surfaced afterwards because people had done things that really in their other parts of themselves they didn't want to do. They had hurt people, and they had done things that they didn't want to do. And just to carry it a little bit further, and I'll make it personal, when I inventory those 14 years, I mean, I have to always say, if I hadn't surrendered to my teacher as a young woman, I wouldn't have written any books. And that, you know, maybe 20 years later, we wouldn't even be here having this conversation. I wouldn't know these wonderful people, right? So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there was a point where I had decided that I wanted and needed to have a child in my life. And my teacher, I was single at the time, and I was just certain that I was either going to adopt and I was going to go pursue this. My teacher, who was a crazy wisdom teacher and usually very on about his insights, had really felt that, you know, he had a different opinion on it, and it was expressed, you know, he expressed it clearly. When I stopped doing guru yoga, right, in response to that, and I told him, like, hey, this is, after 2 or 3 years of battling about this, I said, hey, this is the decision I'm going to make. I would really like to have your support and blessing. And I shifted where I was coming from immediately, said, you know, what would ever make you think that you would do anything that wouldn't receive my support and blessing? And I'm putting in that example because if I had listened to his crazy wisdom, right, it's very hard to tell when there's a crazy wisdom teacher, which is coming from their crazy wisdom and which is coming from something else, because no teacher is going to be 100% congruent. And had I listened to that, I would have considered that whole relationship probably a huge traumatic experience. And I would have had, you know, the rest of my life, if I had listened to that, I would have, you know, it would have been a wound and something I would have had to work with very deeply. In this case, I didn't listen. I did what I wanted, and it was critical. So I hear your question, but it's like in Western culture, without without supplementing these awakenings with this depth psychological knowledge, I think the risk is far greater.
Yeah.
You want to say anything more about that at the moment?
Yeah, I think I agree. I agree with everything you said. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that a teacher-student relationship is a risky business. And no matter what, we can reduce the risk, but it will always be, if it's the real thing, it will always be risky for different parts of ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is risky, but so is, right? The whole thing is, and it's really risky to not do that work. Really risky not to do this work. Lindsay, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here.
You want to jump in? Somebody wants to hear Jack's response to your question, and I haven't even seen your question yet. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Hey there.
I asked how to address premature claims to enlightenment with a self-identifying spiritual teacher. And I actually just very recently got a hold of your book, Halfway Up the Mountain, and it's really shed light on a lot of questions that I've been grappling with along the lines of the question that I stated, and particularly the section of the book, Mistaking Mystical Experience for Enlightenment. And so I was just wondering, I'd just like to hear more about that and how it can be addressed with teachers.
Yes. So, right, I think there's two pieces. One is when a teacher self-proclaims enlightenment, and then how that enlightenment gets confused with with mystical experiences. So I really, and you and I have dialogued about this a little bit before, right? It's a conversation that's making way without peers. And again, right, you're a leader in a system. Without peers and support outside the system, you're there. Rather, I'll say it in the affirmative, that there has to be people outside of one's own system to affirm it, right? Even in the non-dual teaching world, you can't to have an awakening experience and think you're a teacher and then go to another non-dual teacher and share your experiences and have them validate the claim is very different than availing yourself to support of people from other traditions, teachers with a lot of experience and long-term experience. I think what happens, and I'm going to just venture into some of the people I know who you know, in the younger generation who participated in some of the courses that you've been involved with, where it's so easy to be brought through a process and right start to experience certain states and experience them consistently, and those states will match with plenty that we will read about enlightenment, right? Or even in one's own system, right? That these states mean that to name them as some kind of awakening, and now you're in this enlightened state. Now we're all in this state, and it's really dangerous. So right earlier, back to that example of Yogi Ramsurat Kamar, it's like what people often claim as their enlightenment is like the most baby step in an endless process of awakening, right? So maybe we have access to a non-dual state or a certain set of experiences, and we've had it many times, and maybe it's fairly consistent. And even consistent, right? When we're younger, consistent might be 3 months or 6 months or a year, right? And then if you ask teachers who have run through the gamut, right, consistent, I'm talking about 20 years, 30 years, right, is much more about consistency. But even when it's consistent, I think when people start to hang a label of awakening and enlightenment on themselves, it very often stunts further growth. It stunts further possibility, and the identification with that is very seductive, and especially in younger generations. I think it happens because I was part of it. I went to a spiritually oriented grad school, and like you did, but maybe 15 or 20 years before, and we each generation, like, we will do these collective things, and whatever the next medicine that's come in, or the next tradition that's come in, or the next process that's come in, and we feel like we are the first people that have ever been doing this, and that we are creating a certain amount of people that have never been available before, and this amount of people are waking up. But there's actually a context in which that same feeling has arisen, over many decades. So I think that we need peer support. We need to be really cautious and rigorous, not about our passionate pursuit about our own awakening or enlightenment, about what's possible, right? But about understanding that in a larger context. One example I'll throw out here, of course, probably most people have encountered the American Ram Dass, right, the Be Here Now author, and right, I wasn't there in the 60s in Golden Gate Park because I wasn't alive when he was doing these things, right? But they were all enlightened there and having these experiences and taking their acid and so forth. And I saw him speak maybe a decade ago. He had had a major stroke, and he was speaking at a bookstore near where I live. And somebody in the back, a young seeker, said, "Ram Dass, would you still say that Be Here Now is the message for us? Is that the message we need, that we told the world?" And he, he was very reflective and slow in his response, as he has been since his stroke. And he said, I still do think that Be Here Now is necessary, but what that means for me has really changed. And being here now means being here And he just made a whole list, right, with all aspects of development and all aspects of our integration and what's happening here and politically and what's happening in the earth and what's happening with other people and where they are at. So that the being here now, you know, had broadened significantly. So I think there is a little a trap of, right, any new generation that's eventually going to get older and then learn from the inevitable humbling of life, that we have this state and we can replicate it, and that means this, right? And it's not that it doesn't, right? Like power to young people awakening together and working together, but to always be in a situation where we, like this spiritual teacher, right, who seeks out counsel and perspective outside of the system, and seeks out elders, and was willing to really closely track the inevitable identification with those states. I was thinking the other day, I had finished my yoga teacher training for 4 months. This was about 12 years ago, and I had been in yogic high land for months, right? And I had been consistent, and it was the last day, and I said to my teacher, I was leaving, and I said, I was going to visit my family, the next day, and I said, do you think that this state is going to go away? It's been so consistent, and walking on the beach, and she just turned and she said, yes. And even when she said it, I mean, it was just there. I was like, of course. And then I was going to, work out being in a relationship with my spiritual teacher and my father and his girlfriend. And yeah. Does that speak to your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Oh, somebody wanted to hear Jack respond to Lindsay. Let's hear what you have to say, Jack.
Gosh, I don't know. I'm learning so much from you, Marianne. I'm not sure if I can offer anything. My heart sang, Lindsay, because you asked the question. Because your own authority, I can hear it. Because you can smell something is off. And while a teacher might be blinded by our own bullshit, it might come from students. Wouldn't that be just wonderful if the market were the ones to say, I think you're full of crap. I think this is not okay. And I don't know how our culture is going to change, because that's what we're trying to do. We're wanting cultural shifts in the non-dual and spiritual sector to happen. And I'm really excited about the potentiality of people, students, peers, questioning the authenticity of somebody who is self-proclaimed. The very fact of somebody's self-proclaimed is questionable anyway. If somebody's a spiritual teacher, if they didn't get dragged by the scruff of the neck into doing this work, I've got a question. That's my own perspective. It's like, you chose to be a teacher? I mean, why would anybody choose this? Like, give me any career except this. I work in the local garden centre, but this is what I have to do. This is the only thing that makes sense. So, and this is where I grow the most. So somebody choosing, yeah, that's a red flag to me. Choosing to like, yes, I am awake and I'm choosing this career. That's the question. But I just love that students are finding the autonomy to smell when something is off.
Thank you.
Hey, I want to draw on Rick here to see if is anything speaking to you to add to this conversation, whether it's a question or a comment or a commentary. So Rick, as many of you know, but maybe some of you don't, had started Buddha at the Gas Pump online interview series that has gone very viral in the world and is making a real mark in spiritual culture. So I'm just so glad you're here and really interested in your contribution to the conversation. Unmute Rick, please. Somebody? Can I unmute Rick?
I think okay, I'm unmuted. Well, I like the theme that just came up. I mean, the whole thing has been interesting to me, and this topic is something I've been thinking about for a couple of decades, a lot. But the theme of students feeling empowered and confident to call teachers on their BS, as Jack just said. I think a lot of times students are kind of intimidated. There's a peer pressure thing going on, and they can get flack from their peers among other students in that group if they raise any issues or questions. So there's a pressure on students not to rock the boat. And I think that one of the aims of the APST, as I see it, is to embolden students to sort of stand in their own integrity and say something if they see that the emperor has no clothes, to reference that story. And that's it. I mean, I could elaborate on that point, but I think it's not just going to happen from the side of teachers feeling like they should clean up their act. It's a collective thing, and the students are perhaps even a more important part of the equation than the teachers, because there's more of them, and it's a lot easier if there's strength in numbers, and if the whole sangha says, hey, there's something wrong here, then the teacher's going to have to look at that, as has happened perhaps in that group that you've been counseling. And I think hopefully the APST will have as much to offer people who aren't professional teachers as it does to those who are, and there'll be a place for them to participate and engage and interact and so on. So that's all I really have to say.
For now.
Yeah, for now. I'm notorious for saying too much.
Hey, Jack asked who you are. You want to say who you are? Jack is a spiritual teacher. She's on a massive book deadline that she's broken away from to be on this course.
And she's been on Batgap a few times, and there'll be a panel discussion we did at the SAND conference, released in a week or two, that Jack is part of. And Jack has done more work than anybody in founding the APST, the Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers. She's, with a lot on her plate already, she really took that on in a big way and has spent probably hundreds of hours molding it into shape.
Others, anything that you're wanting to bring to the table, feel free to raise your hand. Let us know what you're thinking about, who you are. Yeah, oh, Christiane, and I saw that you had written a question here too, so please, got you unmuted. Christiane? Is that how you say your name? We can't hear you, even though you're unmuted. There we go. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Great. I'm calling in from Germany, and I have one question about the course you are offering. My position is I'm what you would call a Buddhist teacher working with the Ten-Theta framework, and I'm a psychoanalyst, and I mix both actually in my work. Like when one, especially after Fetish for Five design over, such a lot of emotional stuff comes up and during the work, and so I just mix it up, and I just say, okay, let's now look at this, let's put Theta work aside and look at this. I have another question. How do you think about mixing it up in quite a fluent way? And also, I have another question about the class you're offering. Do you also look into trouble with teachers training new teachers? I have trouble with this, really. And so that would be something I would also be very interested in.
So in terms of integrating or mixing it up, as you're calling it, absolutely. I'm right now in meditation sangha and that's actually the practice where all the spiritual teachings are. If I were to be a spiritual teacher, which I do not want to be, it's actually what I would do, because I find it so compatible. So where the psychological work is part and parcel of our spiritual training, and even right when there's enough understanding that the actual spiritual practices are not really modified, but they're made to include the wound and the psychological dimension as part and parcel of the awakening. That's the kind of right, my life's been in tandem equally, you know, my devotion to psychological and spiritual paths. So I like to mark them as separate, but when integrated, I just think it's so much more effective. So I strongly support that. And as to your question about, will it talk about teaching trainers, certainly, but really more importantly, it will work on whatever the individuals there need, right? It's a place where we can consciously engage that peer support. So with the group I'm working with now, I might bring a topic, or we're working our way down that topic, but always like open to that, and right, whatever is coming up in the lived experience of the participants, because if it's coming up in the lived experience of one person, it's going to be coming up for other people too. So certainly. And you know what, I don't know how many spiritual communities and teachers are going to seek out the psychological training that this community has, but what I notice is that I don't even necessarily need to like be in that spiritual training or even feel totally compatible with it. Like I feel willing to support somebody's psychological, like trauma integration process, right? Just to support them doing whatever they are doing more effectively. I just discovered these people and I feel very connected, but I think that this can apply to even when we don't feel necessarily congruent, because these topics, like the ones on my list, that they're quite universal, right? And they're not just in spiritual communities, they're in religious communities, and they're in psychological communities, and they're in yoga studios, and they're in mindfulness communities, and they're in meditation centers, and right, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
people understanding, I put it several years ago on my website, I'm like, psychotherapy is not something you do because something's wrong. It's something you engage in because it's 138 years old. There was a new, right, a growth of a new field that's been so augmented by the understandings of neuroscience and somatics and trauma healing, that there's this beautiful, you know, field that's made to specifically address the challenges of the Western psyche, and it's so complementary.
Yes, and I think it's absolutely necessary to do that. I was blown away. You know how psychoanalytical training goes. You have like 1,500 hours of training psychoanalysis or something like that during the whole study time. And I was blown away how much stuff was left that came up during my own path through the factors. And I actually devoted months of only looking into this with help, because I just had no choice. There was really no choice. And I think it's absolutely crucial. And so also there is not so much shadow left in the end. And we find the fetters are a certain structure, and at some point in the last subtle sense of self goes. And if there is trauma left that hasn't been addressed or not even remembered, it will come at that point. All defense mechanism will be gone. And we had people really with freezing reactions. It was very terrible. Not luckily, I have a trauma education as well, so we could address that. But we were surprised. We didn't know that would come up. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to come to a close soon. Craig, is there any question or contribution? I noticed that Craig put in the chat box references for how you can find out more about Rick or Jack or Craig. Any questions or anything you want to jump in with before we begin to close for the day?
Yeah. One, I just want to thank you, Mariana, for showing up and doing this. And then I want to thank everyone, of course, for being here and being a part of this. But one of the things that was really beneficial for me early on is, you know, on the path that I studied with, it's all it was a path that Aurobindo taught. He was neighbors with Yogi Ram. And so evolution was absolutely included in the path. And so psychological development, psychological evolution, a willingness to do, some of this deeper tantric work of looking at the shadow, and to see that how all these things, how, our psychological shadow or pain or trauma, whatever it is that covers up each of the chakra centers, and the willingness to do that type of work, they're all doorways to greater levels of awakening, greater levels of maturity, greater level of manifestation and potential for oneself. So to me, they always went, they were always hand in hand and intermixed. And even in the way, that I work with my students in my community is, I have no separation. To me, the psychological and the spiritual, it's all one movement. I think there's the great danger in divorcing these two. And, when I work with students from other traditions who come in, with trauma that they've experienced from other teachers or other communities, it has to do with that very thing, that there was this divorcing between spirituality and growth. And to me, it just seems silly to ever divorce those two, that there's a transcendent world that's absolutely perfect, and then there's a relative world which we ignore and deny. I mean, if we come from a tradition that has that as a model, there's a huge shadow in it, and a great danger there. And it breaks my heart at this moment in history. It seems so clear the necessity of psychological work, trauma work, healing work, development work, and that it's all a step forward, on the path. And so fully support everything you brought forward, Mariana, and again, want to deeply thank you for being a part of this and offering this group. And I think it's a wonderful invitation for us as teachers, just our leaders, just to admit our humanity, our humility, and to say, yeah, I'm happy to grow. Sometimes, when I'm doing traditional counseling and there's a woman in my office, and she's, wanting to bring her husband, and I say, well, tell them it's like an oil change. It's a good thing. It's a healthy thing for a car, to have an oil change, to have a tune-up. Sometimes we're at a stage when we need to do a major overhaul. And I'm such a big fan of this, this willingness to show up and to be a part of a movement where we're growing, because we benefit so greatly. Like Christiane was speaking about, it's our shadow covers up aspects of our divinity. And so yes, just a big thank you to everyone, and big thanks to Mariana. So yeah.
Just before we sign out, I'm seeing Mariken and Jan here. Is there anything you want to throw into the conversation? And Craig, when you say that this is, we can show up and admit to our humanity, and then I'm looking around at these people, and I'm like, you get to show up with people like this. I didn't know that I would know so many people or had a little contact or Doug, but these are to show up with peers, and not just with the peers of what is known to you, but who are doing something else. Mariken runs a big yoga studio in the Netherlands, and Jan has this huge amount of experience with different communities, right? And learn from each other's experience. Anything either of you want to throw in? Don't want to put you on the spot. But Suzanne, just in case they do, if you could unmute Mariken and Jan. Oh, I can. There we go.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jan. Yeah, I think it's very important to see that even when you're a student, you need to have your own integrity. And I can see so many times that students are coming just falling into pieces in front of the teacher and giving everything over, taking no responsibility for nothing. They just want to be taken care of. And I think that is one of the main traps for all of us, actually, that we're not having our own integrity. We're just so blindsided by the glow of the teacher. we put them on a pedestal. And I also seen that when you put the teacher on a pedestal and when something goes wrong, the only thing you want to do is to tear them down and really, really tear them down. And I've seen it a couple of times, and it's really, it's a heartbreak to see that. And the thing with the sexual scandal, it's a two-way path here. I see that many people that are involved in, they think they get something from it. And if you're on a teacher role or counseling position, you have I think we should have a responsibility. We have a responsibility there, but it's very easy to bypass that. And we are kind of get so entangled in power because we are in power, but it becomes like an egoic power that comes out, and it's not for the benefit of all. So I think that's, and also have the discernment when oh, I got this impulse to say this to someone, and my sense is that most of the things that comes out is coming through my filter. Doesn't matter how clear I am, it still comes through my filter. And we need to ask ourselves, is this of benefit for the person right now? Instead of giving some form of advices or anything, more asking questions about what do you think, what, and not support people. I like the word empower people. For me, it takes things to another level. So I like the practicality of this thing. So thank you.
Thank you. Peter has a question in a moment, but Mari-Ken, anything you want to throw in?
Yes, well, actually, Jan, couldn't agree more with what Jan was saying, and just feel it's about taking responsibility. You know, if you're a leader or a teacher or a student, in whatever you do when we connect with others, is really fully taking responsibility. And I'm just very grateful that this opportunity is here, and that it's quite wonderful that you guys set up this meeting with so many different people all around the world discussing the similar topic. And I run a large yoga studio, and I am in a spiritual community, and I see the similarities which I see with my teachers and with my students, as Jan was saying, and also with devotion and you know, the misuse of power that are actually given to teachers, or some teachers grab it in a way. And when you host something like in a studio, it's almost like a basis that everybody should have, is to discuss the topics like we're discussing here. And in my opinion, or as long as I'm aware of, it's never been discussed before. I'm just really grateful and, well, in a way, unfortunate that it has to be like this, but it is good that it's now here. So that's why I'm joining.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I think we'll take one last question from Peter, who came from New Zealand, right? I can unmute you. Here we go.
From Vancouver.
Oh, from Vancouver. Confusing.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you guys for letting me do this. I couldn't really type a question because I didn't quite know how to word it. I'm not a spiritual leader or something like you guys are amazing, and I'm just a person. So, but I did end up becoming a leader of a men's group. I was voted in to take over, and it's been amazing. But one thing I've noticed is a lot of the younger guys in my group are doing psychedelics and having, for lack of a better term, unearned enlightenment. I don't know how to term it any other way. It's like they have these amazing experiences and think that's the answer. If I could just be there all the time, like that'll solve the problem. And I'm like, it seems to be a little bit, they don't seem to have an architecture that can contain that much release of energy. I don't know the words I want to use, but And so they're kind of getting into this, flowing into this trap of, oh, if I just do another journey, I'll hit Aya this weekend, and then next weekend I'll try Iboga. I don't know if this is making sense, but it's really become a thing here in Vancouver in particular, in certain communities. If anybody has anything to say to this, I would really appreciate just any open feedback of helping these young men maybe not fall into what I'm starting to see as a bit of a trap.
I mean, I have a lot of experience with this topic, and it's also very delicate, right? Being in the position you're in. And when you say I'm not a leader, I'm just a person, you know, I have to say, like, every spiritual leader is just a person. That's the whole point.
Okay.
The whole point, that we have to understand. And I know that there's no shortcut for integration, and you know, many people have said it in different ways. Many teachers. I was listening to a keynote of A.H. Almas, Anita Lee, a wonderful leader of the Diamond Approach, and he was giving a keynote a couple of years ago at one of the non-dual psychotherapy conferences, and you know, the first thing he said is you can all go and have your, you know, huge experiences, whether there's, you know, psychedelic or, you know, even meditation overloads, right, or massive yogic experiences, and then spend the next 20 or 30 years integrating them, you know, or you will take a gradual path to your own awakening. And I don't think there are shortcuts. And at the same time, I taught grad school at San Francisco, so certainly no less so than in Vancouver, where you know, everyone's very experimental. I was a student there once upon a time. So I also know that critiquing it in a certain way alienates people. So it's a little bit similar, even though Lindsay wasn't talking about the psychedelics, you know, young people having these enlightenment experiences or collective experiences, these big spiritual experiences, and then thinking that that's the path or mistaking it for enlightenment. And I think that we can, you know, compassionately provide context for people that, you know, that those experiences, that those experiences, regardless of how strong they are going to need to be integrated into our lived experience, and that more experiences do not necessarily, right, that there are really no shortcuts, and that there's no fast track. But even as I'm saying that, you know, you can provide the context, and then people are actually going to learn from their own experience in that way. But when we're thinking that this awakening is some kind of state, right? That's such a setup for us. It's like when
if I was using like Wilberian language, they think it's a stage, like a station. Like it's like that state is where I need to be. That is life, and it's like as just a normal working person who fell into an awesome situation with these men. It's like, wow, I get it, but my goodness, it just feels like I'm worried about you. Like you're not moving forward. You're just a dude, in my estimation, who's really just enjoying maybe getting high, and it just seems out of my realm. I don't know. Like I never wanted. Yeah.
Sometimes,
go ahead.
I mean, I've seen people use medicines in the service of awakening, but it's like when something is taking us out of a box or into an experience that we have not had or exposure to, right? It can be very useful. So medicines can be used therapeutically, but when they're just being engaged with repetition, when I hear, you know, my clients come in and they say, oh, I've done 100 ayahuasca journeys. And, you know, that doesn't mean anything to me more than somebody having done one or no ayahuasca journeys, right? And talking about anything that's a fast path to enlightenment or these fast tracks. So I know that, right, in skillful context, they can. I'm glad you're bringing this up for APST. I'm sure it will come up as a topic. But yeah, very important to bring up. So
I just wanted to say something that might help. I mean, what turned things around for me, having done psychedelics for about a year in 1968, was kind of the realization. I was reading a Zen book one night on LSD, and it's 3 a.m. or something. I couldn't sleep, and it hit me that, wow, these guys are really serious, and I've been kind of screwing around for the last year, you know. But that's it. I really have to kind of turn this around. Stop taking drugs. I've had as much experience as drugs are really going to give me. Now I need to learn to meditate and do it more incrementally and naturally. But one thing that really struck me was, you know, you're stuck in this body, and if you damage it in some way, you're going to be stuck in a damaged body all your life. I was 18 years old, and I really took that to heart and tried to live the rest of my life since then in ways that healed the body and didn't damage it. So I don't know what the track record is with all these things that people are doing these days, and how much damage, how many kind of casualties there may be, but I'm sure there are some. And I would just go by the mantra, safety first, you know, and you know, and the notion that just one more trip of some sort after 100 of them is going to teach you something you didn't already know seems a little ludicrous to me. And people should just be kind of more cautious, because, you know, this is serious business, and you really don't want, it's a beautiful vehicle we have, you know, this physiology, and you need to culture it in a responsible way in order for a real long-term progress to be made.
So I think we should close here. I'm on the therapeutic hour, so I've got 7 minutes till go back to my day job. But to those who have stuck with us, to those who are listening into the future, like, thank you. And even as we start to hear from individuals, and I wanted to call people out because I wanted to, the ones I know, I want you all to see the quality of the people that are coming forth to this conversation. And in the group that I run, I mean, I learned so much. That's the whole point. We really get to pool our shared experience. So we'll send a follow-up email, and, you know, everybody's welcome to join APST. You don't have to say, I'm not a spiritual teacher, so I can't join. I think it's free these days, membership, right? So everyone's welcome to join APST, and we'll, in the follow-up email, I'll send information about the group. I'm very easy to find online. Just put my name in and you'll get the information. But really to thank Rick and Craig and Jack for bringing together, and Suzanne, bringing together these efforts, and just really happy to meet so many new like-minded people, and really inviting you all into the conversation. It's really a collective effort that I think we can, I want to see what's possible. That's what's exciting to me. That's why I joined my first board. I want to see what's possible with these other trailblazers, and be in such good company. So thank you all. Shall we close here? Okay. Hugs from California. That's what we do here. All right. So long, everyone.